You know, every now and then you come across a story in modern history that sounds, well, almost impossible. This is one of those. It's the story of how a tiny island, with literally zero resources, went from being completely written off to becoming one of the wealthiest nations on the entire planet. And they did it all in a single generation. So let's get into the Singapore story.
I mean, just look at this contrast. It is absolutely staggering. Back in 1965, Singapore was basically left for dead. It had just been kicked out of its own country, it was torn apart by internal divisions, and it didn't even have a reliable way to get fresh water for its people. Now, fast forward to today, and the average person in Singapore is actually wealthier than the average American. So the question is, how in the world did they manage to pull that off?
To really understand this incredible comeback, we have to go right back to the beginning. We have to start at rock bottom, because you need to understand just how hopeless the situation looked when Singapore was suddenly, and very unwillingly, born.
So, for most of its early history, Singapore's fate was decided by other people. First, the British showed up and turned it into a major trading hub. Then, during World War II, the Japanese army did the unthinkable. They captured what the British called their impenetrable fortress. And they did it by attacking from the one direction nobody thought to guard, the jungle. After the war, Singapore figured its only shot was unity, so in 1963 it joined up with its neighbor to form Malaysia. That whole experiment lasted just 2 years.
You have to understand, this wasn't some triumphant, happy declaration of independence. When Singapore's leader, Lee Kuan Yew, went on TV to announce that Malaysia had basically kicked them out, he openly cried. He wasn't crying tears of joy. He was crying because he truly, genuinely believed his new nation was doomed from the start.
And honestly, who could blame him? The checklist of problems they faced was just insane. No land, no oil, no food, not even enough drinking water. The population was bitterly divided by race riots and nobody had any jobs. You've got this tiny island with no army, surrounded by much larger neighbors who weren't exactly friendly. The odds of survival, they look like zero.
But you know, when you're faced with a situation where the only choices are succeed or disappear, something incredible can happen. Lee Kuan Yew and his team, they chose to succeed. And they started tackling every single one of their impossible problems with solutions that were radical, totally unconventional, and just brilliantly pragmatic.
So let's start with problem number 1. And it's about as basic as it gets, survival. Singapore got most of its water from Malaysia. Yep, the same country that had just kicked them to the curb. If Malaysia ever decided to just turn off the tap, the nation would die of thirst. This was a true existential threat, and it had to be solved like yesterday.
So what did they do? They basically declared war on their lack of water. They decided they were going to turn the entire island into one giant water catchment system. They built reservoirs everywhere you could imagine. They passed new laws saying every single building's roof had to be designed to collect rainwater. And they poured money into what was basically science fiction at the time, figuring out how to turn salty seawater into clean drinking water on a massive scale.
Okay, so water is on its way to being solved. Next problem. How do you create jobs and make money when you have literally nothing to sell? Now, back in the 1960s, the standard advice for any new country was self-sufficiency. Close your borders, protect your industries, and make everything yourself. Singapore looked at that playbook and decided that was a terrible idea.
They did the complete opposite. They threw their doors open and declared to the entire world that they were open for business. They created a system with absolutely zero tolerance for corruption, a rock-solid rule of law, and low taxes. The goal was simple: become the safest, most efficient, most profitable place for a big global company to set up its Asian headquarters, to become the stable, reliable economic bridge between the East and the West.
All right, so the economy is getting sorted, but at the same time you've got this massive social crisis. Most of your people are living in these dangerous, overcrowded, unsanitary slums. A country can't really thrive if its citizens don't even have a decent, safe place to live. The government decided it had to give everyone a proper home.
And this is where the pure genius of their system comes in. The government started building apartments like there was no tomorrow. But, and this is the crucial part, they didn't just give them away. They created a mandatory savings program for every worker, and then they let people use that saved money to buy their apartments. Why was this so important? Because it instantly created a nation of homeowners, millions of people who now had a direct financial stake in the success and stability of their own country.
And the result of this? It was just astounding. In less than 20 years, they went from a population living in slums to having over 80% of their citizens owning their own modern apartment. It was nothing short of a social and economic revolution.
Okay, so you've got water, an economy, and housing. But what good is all that if you can't protect it? This brings us to the final existential problem: defense. Singapore was tiny, it was vulnerable, and it had no army to speak of. How could it possibly stop an invasion from a much larger neighbor? Their answer was a strategy that Lee Kuan Yew called the poisonous swallow. Think about it. The idea isn't necessarily to win a war outright. The idea is to make yourself so painful to attack, so poisonous to swallow, that any potential enemy would decide it's just not worth the cost. To do this, they made military service mandatory for all men, which created a huge citizen army, and they poured money into buying the most advanced military tech they could find. Now, there's no arguing that these policies worked. I mean, the economy boomed, the streets were safe, the nation was secure. But this incredible transformation didn't come for free. It came at a price, and it involved a fundamental trade-off that really defines what Singapore is all about. The philosophy driving a lot of these decisions was something Lee called Asian values. The core idea is pretty simple. The needs of the community as a whole, things like social order and harmony, are more important than the rights and freedoms of any single individual. The group comes before the person.
And this right here, this is the central bargain of the Singaporean model. It's a deal. On one side of the deal, you get incredible prosperity. You get sparkling clean streets, almost zero crime, and jaw-dropping economic growth. But the other side of the deal, the price you pay, is strict government control over the media, some very tough laws like you can get fined for chewing gum, and a political system where there's very little room for opposition.
Whenever Lee Kuan Yew was criticized by Western countries for this approach, his response was always incredibly direct and completely unapologetic. He basically argued that for a brand new nation on the brink of collapse, Western-style liberal democracy just wasn't the right tool for the job. Order and prosperity had to come first. He framed it as a simple choice, and he was convinced most people would willingly make that trade.
So, look, whether you agree with those trade-offs or not, and it's a huge debate, the results themselves are just undeniable. The transformation is really one for the history books.
When you boil it all down, Singapore achieved something no other country in history has ever done. It made the leap from the third world to the first world, all within a single human lifetime. Just take a look at this chart. Today, Singapore's GDP per capita isn't just higher than the United States, it's also higher than Great Britain's, its old colonial ruler. Let that sink in for just a moment. The tiny, supposedly doomed, swampy island is now wealthier than the massive empire that once controlled it. It's just wow.
But of course, the story isn't over. The very success of Singapore's model has created a whole new set of challenges. They're now dealing with an aging population, a sky-high cost of living, and the really tricky question of how you maintain that top-down social control in the age of the internet. And they have to figure all this out as the founding generation, the people who built all this, are passing from the scene. So this leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? Was the Singapore story a complete one-off, a unique miracle born from a perfect storm of history, geography, and incredible leadership that can just never be repeated? Or does its model, a model that openly prioritizes pragmatic discipline over democratic freedoms, actually hold lessons for other nations trying to find their way in the 21st century? That is definitely a question worth thinking about.